Good evening all, and welcome. I hope you're ready, because the police have encountered some pretty creepy stuff, which I'm sure you'd love to hear about. It's time to get comfortable, grab your mag light, and let the darkness take control. I shadowed a police officer for a school project. He told me a lot of stories, but this one, he said, messed him up more than anything. He got a call late at night that a car had crashed off the highway. He has been a police officer for about 6 years, and at the time, he had not seen anything too bad at that point. He gets to the crash, and he notices he was the first officer or any emergency worker to arrive, so he tried to control the scene. He ran up to the car to see what he needed to call in. Well, he said he was expecting the crash not to be bad, because the outside of the car was not damaged too badly. The car was on its side, but was not in too bad a shape. With all the new safety features in a car, he knew that everyone in the car should be okay. Well, he was half right. The car was filled with 2 parents and 3 kids. The parents were already out of the vehicle, but none of the kids. People saw the crash and helped the parents who had crawled out from the car. The parents were so shocked, they didn't know what happened to their car or their kids. So he checked the car for any signs of life, but there were none to be found, until they saw the little girl still breathing. He radioed in that he needed a medical team there right away. One of the kids was alive, but had a major cut on her head and was not responding. But he felt a pulse, so he knew the child had limited time before she was dead too. The other 2 kids were sadly a different story. When they crashed, they were going at 45. Because they were on an off-ramp, they slowed down to get off. But one of the tires exploded, and the mother lost control and flipped the car into some small trees. The kids were no match for the car, but these kids near the window were no match for the trees. The kid's head exploded on impact, with the tree spears, and one of the kids' heads was just all gone, and his face and brains were all over the tree that hit him. The other child had some of his head together, but the tree hit him in the neck and his jaw, so his head was cut clean off his body. The kid with a big cut on the top of her head was the youngest of the kids and the shortest, so the tree just clipped the top of her head. She lived after the medical team did a badass job of fixing her. The parents were sent with their last surviving child to the hospital. The officer I shadowed said he still dreams about that night, 24 years later. I am a Danish cop. Some years ago, a coked-up driver hit a woman in central Copenhagen. She was hit at about 120 kilometers an hour while crossing the street with her boyfriend in hand. Her body flew about 100 meters down the street. When the first patrol car arrived at the place of impact, the boyfriend was sitting beside the body, caressing her head. There had to be 3 officers to pull him away from the woman. The driver was a well-known man that had done something close to this before. 2 underage Danish girls were in the back seat of the car when he hit her. I ended up in a fight with one of them because she wouldn't stop phoning different people while we were chasing the driver in the area around the car. Oh, and he could have killed about 10 people. About 20 seconds before he hit her, he drove through a red light at the busiest pedestrian crossing in Denmark. It was about 1 on a Saturday night, and it was the night the Christmas beer was released. He got sentenced to 4 years 6 months, the longest sentence in Danish history for a hit and run. Prisoners in Denmark only serve 3/4 of their sentence, and in the weekend, he got to go home from prison on the last year of his sentence. It's only a couple of months since the newspapers wrote that he hadn't returned to prison after a weekend home. That is the lenient Danish prison system for you. This is a story my dad told me. He was a border patrol agent back in the 90s and early 2000s. I was about 4 or 5 at the time that this particular story took place, but he never told anyone in the family except me. Now that I am involved in law enforcement, he waited about 19 years to tell me, or anyone for that matter, about this. Basically, my dad was a human tracker. He would find prints in the dirt, leaves and the like, and would be able to tell about how many people, how long they'd been and all that stuff. He would often go out alone and literally hunt people down, like you'd track a deer or any other wild animal. One night, he was in his patrol vehicle, and one of their cameras caught a group of people crossing the river. My dad and a team of about 10 guys met up to try and catch them all as they made their way up the river banks and into the heavily wooded scrub/bushed area. They saw border patrolmen, and of course the group of about 20 scattered. My dad broke off to chase one of the smallest groups that splintered off, 2 women, and several small children. One of the women was even holding an infant, both mothers. As my dad got close enough, they realized he would catch them, instructed their children to all jump back into the river, and the woman holding the infant handed it to one of the older kids. Where they chose to send their kids back in was deeper and rougher water. The kids jumped in, and the 2 women kept running. My dad said he had half a mind to shoot them right then and there, but he didn't. He jumped into the water and managed to grab 2 of the children. He was literally drowning, holding the 2 he managed to grab above water. Luckily, his partners showed up and fished the 3 of them out, and 1 more child out of the water too. The infant, and most likely the child who took her into the water, were found downstream dead in the morning. The 2 women, aunts of the kids, were caught and didn't give a crap about the 2 that drowned. According to my dad, they just saw the 2 kids as cargo, and as long as a few lived, it did not matter. These are my 2 stories. 1. At night, I responded to a report of either shots fired or fireworks near a football stadium. It was football season, so big tents were set up all around. Besides that, the stadium and parking lot were mostly empty. 9 out of 10 times a call like this ends up being fireworks or a car backfiring. Upon arrival, I circulate the parking lot, and there's nobody around. Shortly before I was going to clear the call, my spotlight illuminates what looks like a guy sitting in a chair under one of those big tents. I holler at him, and he doesn't answer. So I call it into dispatch, get out, and walk slowly. He's seated in a chair facing away from me, and it looks like his head is down, as in his chin is on his chest. I keep walking up and keep calling out to him, but he doesn't move or answer. I finally walk into the tent and get close enough to realize his head's not down. It's gone. Just gone. I see a shotgun lying next to his feet, and that's when I feel something on my shoulder, some kind of red goop. That's when I shine my flashlight up and see that the ceiling of the tent is completely splattered with a mix of brain, blood and bits of skull, and that it was dripping all over me. 2. Another call for shots fired. This time when I get to the scene, I hear someone screaming behind a house. I run behind the house and see 2 kids, late teens/early 20s, laying down. One has been shot through the arm, not life-threatening but no doubt painful. The other is unresponsive. I run back to my car for my go bag, give the kid shot through the arm a bandage, and tell him to hold pressure. Then start working on the other kid. He's got a chest wound through and through. Sounds like his lungs are already collapsing. I only had one Ashman seal, so I sealed up the back and tried to keep the other hole sealed with plastic from the Ashman seal while I did chest compressions when he stopped breathing. The medics were staging until we could secure the scene. Another officer showed up and we sealed the other wound, but it was already too late. He was pronounced dead at the hospital, which was, actually, right across the street. What stuck with me about this one? It wasn't the first time I'd responded to a shooting or had to deal with first aid or CPR on a victim, but it was the first time I could really say the victim was a victim. Most of the times when we have a shooting, it's gang members versus gang members, or a drug deal gone wrong, or both parties are drunk and high, and basically the victim has at least some responsibility for the situation they're in. Not these kids. It was clear-cut armed robbery. They didn't want to give up their stuff, so they got shot. The victim having some responsibility allows me to lighten the emotional load a bit. Play stupid games, win stupid games, that kind of thing. But when it's someone completely innocent, who was just being, I don't know, a person, that sucks hard. Our detectives eventually caught the guys, and I testified as to what I did and seen, and evidence, preservation and all of that. I wish I could have testified as to the sound the kid's sucking chest would have made, and the gurgling sound he made when he finally stopped breathing, and the smell of him having shat himself. I started as a ride-along during the academy, during the summer of '06, and had to complete a couple of 100 hours. The academy was through a college, so they had slightly different requirements, but I still got post-certified. I showed up to do all the RAL, and was immediately smiled at by the officer I rode with. Not a good sign. Come on, man, let's go. This takes place in a small town in the Potato State, usually really quiet, with the weekly drunk calls and some drugs too. This was different. We showed up to the already cordoned off house and walked in. There was blood everywhere. CSIs had already been there and collected the stuff they needed to, so we didn't really have to be careful where we stepped, other than to preserve our own clothing and shoes. We walked around the house, and it looked like someone had taken a paint roller with red paint and hit it with an air compressor. Red splattered in every room, but the kitchen and dining room. The stench hadn't set in yet, because it was just a short time prior. That is something I learnt later. We eventually made our way to the basement, where the worst scene took place. It truly looked like tomato soup with rice in puddles on the floor and splattered on the walls. Here's what happened. Husband found out that the wife had been cheating on him, so he went to his buddy's house and asked to borrow his shotgun. He waited, had breakfast at a local restaurant, then went back home. He knocked on the door and his wife answered, and he shot his wife point blank in the chest, while Quentin Tarantino has it wrong with all the gore. It's still fairly close when it's point blank. He proceeded up the hallway and killed his kids in their rooms. The cheater confronted him in the hallway, and he hit him point blank too. Then he went to the basement, turned on the radio and shot himself in the head. I specifically mentioned radio on, because it was on softly as we entered the basement. I guess no reason to turn it off. The CSTs didn't. I can't hear If You're Going Through Hell by Rodney Atkins without memories of this coming back. I've been a cop for a while now, And this is one of the calls that still haunts me. I get a call for a domestic assault that has just occurred, and I learn that the victim is at the neighbor's house. I get there and find the female victim's throat has been cut from ear to ear. The neighbor is holding a towel up to her slit throat, and the victim is struggling to breathe. The paramedics are on their way, and I take over holding the towel from the neighbor. I'm trying to apply enough pressure to reduce the bleeding, but it's not so much pressure that I'm strangling her. It was a delicate balance. Quick law lesson. You know that there are laws against hearsay, right? Basically, I can't testify in court about the events that someone else told me about, that I didn't witness. The person who witnessed it would have to testify to it. One of the exceptions is known as the dying declaration. If someone is on their deathbed and believes they are about to die, their statements are exempt from the hearsay rules. I have some serious doubts that this woman was going to live. I wanted to ask her who slit her throat in order for it to qualify as a dying declaration. I needed to be able to testify that she believed she was about to die. So I asked her the question, "Who cut your throat?" She answered. The second was, "You realize you may be about to die?" Which she answered, "Yes." Our eyes were locked, and I still remember the emptiness in her eyes. Within a few minutes, the medic showed up, and my partner and I went next door looking for the suspect. The door was ajar, and we could hear a baby screaming upstairs. We went in, guns drawn. The metallic smell of blood was overpowering, and we made our way upstairs, passing smeared bloody handprints on the walls, and found the child upstairs. He was unharmed, and the suspect was gone. Thanks to the excellent performance of the medical staff, the victim survived. I met her a couple of weeks later, and I was very apprehensive to speak with her again. I had basically looked at her and told her she was going to die. When she opened the door, I could tell she didn't recognize me. She had very little memory of what happened after she was assaulted, and I told her who I was, and she hugged me, crying, and thanked me for saving her life. The suspect ended up pleading guilty, so I never had to testify as to what I had told the victim that night. It still haunts me to this day. I was sitting in my apartment very nearby to a major street in my town. At about 2 a.m, I hear a massive crashing sound from outside, and all the power in my building goes out instantly. I rush outside and it's dead quiet and pitch black. The streetlights were all out. A ways off I see the silhouette of a car wrapped around a telephone pole and start walking towards it. About 50 to 60 feet from the car in the middle of the road, I stumble across the driver's body. Right about this time, I'm trying to figure out what to do to help, and I feel like I'm going a bit crazy because something seems off about the body. A bunch of people from my apartment complex are running out to where I am right about this time, and I'm just stooped over the body kind of in shock. The woman comes up from behind me and starts screaming. Then someone else starts shouting at me, "Did you check for a pulse? Check for a pulse!" I must have snapped out of shock, because I was searching the person's neck and realized there was no head. That's what was so off about the body. Still stooped, I look down the road a bit, and there's a person gently prodding something round and coconut-sized with their foot. Head found. So I stand up and start to walk back to the sidewalk. The person yelling at me to check for a pulse is still raving, and I take them by the shoulders and say, "There's no pulse, because there's no head." In hindsight, it wasn't very delicate of me to say it in that way. So I stand back to the sidewalk, and the fire department and cops are pulling up right about this time. Pretty quick response time given that we're very close to both stations. They ask who was first on the scene, and a few people pointed to me. They asked me if I found the body that way, and if I saw or heard anything useful for them. I told them simply that I didn't have anything to add, that they couldn't plainly see for themselves, and asked if I could go back to my apartment. They were kind enough to let me go without needing my statement or anything. At the time, I was dating a doctor who worked in emergency medicine, and when I spoke to her about it the next day, she was a bit concerned and asked how it was affecting me. I said it was probably nothing compared to what she saw every day, and she said she agreed. But she knew that most normies don't see that stuff very often. The whole ordeal just made me sad, and the idea that there are people who have to deal with it every day made me even sadder. God bless the folks who help pick up the pieces of horror day after day. This didn't happen to me personally, but the absolute worst story I've ever heard and saw pictures of was one of my instructors in the police academy. He had us huddled in close, and when we asked him what was the worst thing about our jobs, he said this story. He was, and still is, a sheriff's deputy, and was responding to a car accident. Where we live, if a deputy is the first on the scene, that means that the accident was way out in the middle of nowhere, and this one was. He said it took him a while to find this one, because the two cars involved had hit head-on and their headlights were out. Finally, he saw a guy covered in blood waving him down. It was the driver of the car that caused the accident, a black Tahoe. The driver had been drinking, and had his whole family in the car. He said he was looking for his daughter. His girlfriend and two other kids had been strapped in and had minor injuries. The driver of the other car, who, coincidentally, they found out later was also drunk, had a pretty bad gash but was okay. But he and the Tahoe's driver couldn't find the oldest daughter, so the deputy, who was the only responder at the time, began searching. He was searching close to the wreck but found nothing. He told us that finally the wind died down and he could hear what sounded like a kitten in a blender. It was the daughter. She was asleep in the car, unseatbelted, and the accident launched her out, off to the side of the road and into a field. She landed in barbed wire. There was a barbed wire fence on the property next to the accident, and she went straight into it. The deputy took out his multi-tool with wire cutters, and each time he cut a piece of the barbed wire, the others would just get tighter. He got her out just as the firemen and first ambulance got there, and he ran with her in his arms to get her to them. Somewhere in the 30 or so feet he had to run, she died. I work in a really large city that's pretty much divided into 4 areas. Near the water, the flatlands, aka the hood, is basically where most calls for service come from. As you move up further north, you have the middle class neighbourhoods. Not as many calls for service here. Most calls are to report burglaries or domestic violence. Up top are the hills, huge houses, mansions, and pretty much where all the wealthy live. Rarely any calls for service in this area. As you move even further north, things start getting rural, and you have redwoods, pine trees, deer, all along stretches of dark road with rural houses and properties with some horses, with acres of space in between each property. We almost never get calls from here, but some of the most heinous or weird things seem to occur up here. Reports of torture dungeons, satanic rituals involving the sacrifice of animals, and satanic orgies and occult gatherings. But for now, I want to talk about something else. The woman in white. I think everyone has heard from someone else about an urban legend in the town that they live in, about the woman dressed in all white, who tries to flag down hitchhikers late at night. We all know you're not supposed to pick up this woman. The cops in our department share tons of urban myths, one of which is about the famous woman in white, who can sometimes be found walking along the side of the road way up in the rural hills. Senior officers have said that if you stop for this woman, she will ask you 2 questions. Can you give me a ride down the hill? Or, can you give me a ride down the hell? If she says hill, it's okay to give her a ride. If she says hell, drive away as fast as you can. On a cool, foggy night at around 3 a.m., I get dispatched to the high hills to investigate a woman reporting that her husband had hit her and locked her out of her house. I started heading up the hill, and as I drive further up it started to get foggy, which is normal on a cool night. I hit my patrol vehicle high beams and continue on. I'm about 20 yards or so away from the residence in question, when I see someone wearing all white running back and forth across the road ahead of me. Thinking this must be the caller, I drive up beside her and ask her if she was the woman who called about her husband. The woman was a white female in her 40s with thin blonde hair, wearing an all-white nightgown and no shoes, very pretty in a modest way. The woman says she didn't call, and I ask her if she needed any help, and she responds, no, but there's a woman screaming over there, and she points towards the area where my call for the service was coming from. I rolled my window up and began to drive towards the home, when the woman starts waving with both hands as I'm driving away, and asks if I could give her a ride down the hill. At this point, I'm not thinking about the woman in white, so I tell her sure. I unlock the door, and she takes a seat in the back of my patrol car. I call for backup as I'm making my way to the call. As I'm leaving my patrol car, I tell the woman to sit tight and that I'll be right back. I lock my patrol car and head towards the house. I can see her sitting in the back of the patrol car anyway, and she has no choice but to sit tight, as there's no way to get out of the rear end of a cop car without the door being opened from the outside. I walk down the long driveway, only to discover that the house where the call originated from is for sale. No curtains covering the windows, no furniture inside, and the home is unoccupied. I have the dispatcher try and call back the victim, who doesn't pick up. So I head back down to my patrol car, and as my backup pulls up, I tell him the corner is GOA, or were we given a bad location, and that I'm going to give this woman in the back of my patrol car a courtesy ride down the hill. Backup officer says, okay, and heads out. I take a seat in my patrol car and begin to apologize to the woman for the wait, but I get no response from her. I look behind me, and no one's there. I'm the only person inside of my patrol car. I call my backup, who had cleared the area, and I ask if he let the woman out of the back of my patrol car, and he says he didn't. He jokes and says, I think you picked up the woman in white. Yeah, I think I did. I've been to a few calls of dead bodies turning up at the water treatment facility. You think normal dead body smell is bad? Try a guy who spent a week soaking in wastewater dumped out onto a conveyor belt. Also, we went to a call of a guy, a vet with PTSD, who shot himself in the head in front of his wife when she demanded he go to a wedding. The rest of the family was in the other room, and by rest I mean about 15 other people. Apparently the last thing the wife said was, we're going to the wedding, pack your bags, and threw a suitcase at him. Well, his Glock was in it, and he simply pulled it out and shot himself right there and then in the temple. The dude really didn't like weddings, I guess. I also just remembered a guy who got run over by a FedEx truck was basically degloved from the waist down. His right foot was by his right ear, and his leg was straight. Also, his disc was by his face. Another guy on PCP got into a wreck. He had an almost amputated right foot, shattered right femur and broken left ankle. Took 5 of us to drag him to the ground and hold him till paramedics could hit him with a sedative. He actually was able to take about 5 or 6 steps before he got to the ground. I rode in the ambulance with him. The medics kept picking up his foot that was attached only by skin and letting it drop. One time he said, "Ow," and I just kept thinking, "Ow? Your foot is off. You have no clue just how much you screwed up your life." I got called to a vehicle versus pedestrian collision. The pedestrian was a small 6-year-old child. He was out playing with friends while he ran across the street with them and was hit and killed by a pickup truck. Medics didn't bother transporting him to the hospital because he had already passed. He was left at the scene so the collision techs could document the case. No criminal charges were filed because it was actually an accident. The boy suddenly ran out in front of the truck. The parents demanded a few minutes alone with the body, and my sergeant advised against it, but they insisted. The accident happened in a residential area, and the neighbours were out in full force watching us work. In order to give the family some privacy, me and some other officers and firefighters held sheets up for a makeshift privacy wall. The thing that sticks out the most is seeing the parents hold up their son and brush his hair to the side. I watched the father touch the dried blood on the asphalt with his index finger, as if to see if it were real or just a bad dream. Overall, they probably spent 5 minutes with him, but it felt like an hour. I was told a story about my cousin who is in the police. He had to go to a suicide attempt. They found a guy who tried to shoot himself. Unfortunately, he was still alive, and he basically had blown his face off. I think he said he later died in hospital. My brother was a PCSO and is now in the police. When he was a PCSO, he had to go to a house call as some parents were on holiday and hadn't heard from their son, and he had a history of being depressed. When my brother got to the house, their other son was outside. They did a sweep of the house and didn't find anything. They had the other son wait outside as they had a feeling they'd find a body. Then they went through the house again, and my brother decided to check the garage instead, and unfortunately, this time was the time the other officer decided to open the garage door from the outside. My brother yelled out not to, but it was too late, and the lad saw his brother hanging in the garage. My brother was really torn up about it, as he really didn't want the lad to see his brother like that. My husband is a police officer. He came home silent and eventually in tears. There was a call from dispatch saying a 5-year-old had called, saying her baby brother wasn't breathing. Ambulance came as well as police officers and CPS for possible child abuse. The scene was horrible. Only the mother was home, and she was passed out surrounded by booze and was obviously a hoarder. Garbage and trash everywhere. Random shit that was not child safe, and it reeked of feces and decaying rodents. The child was found in her bedroom closet and smelled like piss, and looked as if she hadn't been showered or fed in days. The infant of about 3 months was barely breathing, and was just wearing a severely soiled diaper. The closet was full of bottles of curdled milk. Turns out her sister had been trying her best to take care of him under the circumstances. Both children are alive and thriving today, taken by Child Protective Services, and were not separated. I had a call to 911, and the situation still horrifies me. I had just gotten off work and was at my apartment. I was 19 and my friend Tyler was 16. She came up to visit me and we were hanging out with my roommates, the boyfriend's bestie, and his girlfriend. My roommate was drinking and wanted to show us a shotgun he had just bought. I'm military police, so obviously this was a bad idea and a felony since he was drinking. He got it out anyway and ended up shooting Tyler, and her leg was blown off. I called 911 with Tyler, my roommate, and his girlfriend all screaming their heads off. As I called 911, I was directing my roommate on first aid. When the paramedics got there, they told me if I had waited even just a minute longer on directing first aid, Tyler would have died from blood loss and shock. Afterwards, I had to clean the apartment, as the mess hadn't been cleaned by the authorities, as there was a major investigation. So I had to clean the blood and pick up the tissue, skin and bone that was still all over the living room. It was horrifying, but luckily for me, being military police helped me stay calm during the situation. It still haunts me today. I hear all the screaming and remember the look on my roommate's face when he realized what he'd done. The look of complete horror, guilt, and none of us have been the same from it. The leg was absolutely destroyed and was not able to be reattached, but she's still alive, thankfully. My father is a police officer. One night he gets the call of a missing 15-year-old boy. It's 11 p.m, and my father just thinks the kid was out with friends without updating his parents. Yet he gets this gut-wrenching feeling that something was really wrong, and my father was indeed correct. Fast forward a couple of hours to 3 a.m, and my father is walking alongside a trail in the middle of the city. After a while, he hears a thud, and another, and another. Louder and louder it becomes as he approaches the water. As he's standing there watching the water and trying to figure out what's going on, he notices the almost wooden-like thud is coming from somewhere nearby, and notices a rather large object going back and forth. He knows it's what he's dreading. He lifts up his larger, metallic flashlight, heavier than usual, and makes the click, lighting up to be what my father had his suspicions on. The kid was in the water with his head getting drifted in and out of the waves, and his head kept hitting a boulder that was lying next to him. And every time his head hits the boulder, it makes the noise my father still remembers to this day, a simple thud. He bends down and starts to reach his arms under the kid's back and his legs, stands him up on his wobbling knees, and carries him to the patrol car. A skull of the kid as young as your own son that just keeps pouring blood, and every step he takes more and more water out of his mouth. The kid had gone out drinking with his friends, and on his merry way home he fell and knocked himself unconscious, and then just lying in the water lifeless. The father found the kid, so he wanted to be the one informing his parents. Walking up to the red wooden house with white edges on the green door, watching through the windows as he sees the parents sitting on the table with 2 police officers standing next to them, talking. Thud, thud. It sounds as he knocks on the door. He hears footsteps, one by one on the wooden floor covered by a carpet. Thud, thud. As the door opens, he sees their eyes going from happy of joy that their son is standing there to the realization that there's a radio car parked outside, with troubled police standing on the gravel. At the end of his message to inform the parents, the mother and the father, one just like himself, he just breaks down and gives out the most chilling scream my father's ever heard, in a quick fit to start hammering my father in the chest with his closed fists. Because it was my father's fault their son was dead. He found him dead. He was the man who got the very meaning of their son being dead to exist, because he found him dead. He told me that when he came home, he just broke down and started crying when he saw mine and my brother's shoes standing in the hallway. It reminded him that it could have just as easily been him who got the troubled police officer trying to convince him that one of his sons was dead. I have been a municipal police officer for just over 7 years. You never know which ones are gonna mess with you. I've seen murder, fatal accidents, and suicides up close. But one that's affected me the longest was a simple medical call where a man in his 50s had a massive stroke and died in bed. His wife was wailing at us to do something and calling his name. "John! No!" over and over while paramedics worked on him. She told the paramedics that John had only had one drink that night at the country club. For some reason, I connect that in my mind to his death and was unable to drink alcohol for about 3 months, fearing that I too was going to drop dead. Looking back, I guess the couple reminded me of my parents, and this woman's grief reminded me of my own mother's reaction when my dad passed. This wasn't everything I've seen, but it was the worst. My career was effectively ended by a lady that got hit by a car. It basically ripped her whole face off except her eyes. Basically, from the nose down, you could see her vocal cords. She was convulsing on the ground, and a crowd of people were standing around her. I was first there and she was still alive. There was absolutely nothing I could do for her at that point. It was obvious she was bleeding out. I got on the pavement, cradled her in my arms and told her she would be okay, while I tried to stop some of the bleeding. I knew I was lying, but I wanted her not to feel alone and scared when she died. She passed in my arms, as the medics showed up. They worked on her for a bit, but they called it before the chopper landed. 2 weeks later I quit. I've had severe PTSD since then. I drink a lot to self-medicate, I go to therapy, and I've lost all my friends and several jobs. I take pills every day for depression. Sorry for the vivid description, but I can still smell it, see it, the works. My dad was a cop in Toronto for 6 years, but this happened in New Brunswick, Canada. Although the communities are very different, Dad said he's never seen anything nearly as bad in Toronto that screwed him up this bad. Kind of a long story, but it always sticks with me, as it's the only time I've seen my dad cry. My dad used to work night shifts, and would get home as we were getting up for school around 6 a.m. So, we get up like usual, and Dad isn't there, but his clothes were soaking wet laying on our laundry pile. My mom is flipping shit, and eventually Dad comes in crying, scaring me, and tells us what happened. In my city there's a really sharp 90-degree angle going to the bridge. Basically, if you continue straight, you go right into the river. Anyway, my dad and his partner are the first responders to a vehicle that did that around 3 a.m. 4 teenagers were the passengers, 3 boys and 1 girl. The girl got thrown out the roof, one of those old muscle cars with the T-bar roof. The worst part is my dad and his partner drove in to try and get them. My dad is a trained lifeguard and eventually made contact, but it was all too late. All 3 boys died. Not to mention, as an auxiliary member showed up for backup, a volunteer, it turns out the girl who lived was his own daughter. My dad got a Medal of Bravery for this in Ottawa, and upon acceptance he broke down. He said he felt awful for receiving anything when 3 young men died. It always gets to me thinking of this situation. This was about 6 years ago now, and he's always on my arse about driving and being careful, and I totally get why. Much respect to anyone who can do this job. My uncle worked as a cop in Ohakune, New Zealand. His station frequently got reports from local hunters and farmers about hooded men walking around the forest in groups, hunters etc. Also frequently found ceremonial ritual sites in the forest, sometimes even 10 to 15 kilometers inland, through thick bush. Anyway, my uncle was called out to a farmer's property at about 2 a.m. about a decade ago, because the groups of hooded men were walking up and down near the tree line of his property, with torches, placing objects and scaring his family, and the farm animals and whatnot. My uncle arrives and approaches them. He says there were maybe 8, and they just watched him, torches in hand, and not a single one moved a muscle, and just watched him as he tried to appeal to them to leave. After some minutes being completely scared shitless and having no idea how to deal with the situation, he was waiting for backup to assist him, when one of them began speaking in a manner that my uncle can only describe as seductive, and somehow manipulated my uncle into letting them just walk away. He still doesn't remember what they said. He just remembers fading out slightly and then seeing the faces of his fellow officers when he came to. He claims they must have drugged or hypnotized him or something. My uncle doesn't believe in any paranormal stuff though, and that experience messed with him a lot. He quit the force and then became a commercial fisherman some months later. One day we get this non-emergency call on the FD landline, and it's a kind old woman who is very concerned about her cat, which has been on the top of the tree for 24 hours and seems to be unable to come down. I kindly explain to her that we do not respond to calls about cats stuck in trees, despite what she may have heard about Good Samaritan firefighters and all that wonderful Hallmark Lifetime story stuff. She tells me this is her only cat, and blah blah blah. And by the way, she would be happy to make us all a double batch of cookies if we would just please get her cat out of the tree. So I say okay, we'll be there in a few minutes and take her information. We were the police, so we contacted the fire department to do it. They arrive on the scene with a fire truck, an ambulance, and the battalion of chiefs SUV, and us, and she is standing out in the lawn waiting. She leads us to the backyard and shows us a 50-foot cedar tree, which sure as shit has Clyde perched on top of it. So we grab a ladder and send the rookie up there. He gets about 25 feet high up there on the 30-foot ladder, but can't climb the tree any higher because the branches are thin and he will break them. So our battalion chief orders him to tie knots around the tree with the end of a rope and come back down. Now the whole crew gets on the end of the rope and starts slowly pulling the tree over, and we leave Rookie there to catch the cat when the tree gets low enough to the ground for him to reach. And by the way, Clyde was pissed. He was hissing and meowing and making a hell of a racket ever since we first put the ladder up the tree. The old woman goes back inside and finishes with the cookie baking as we were lowering the tree back down with the rope. We get it so that the tree top where the cat is perched is about 12 to 14 feet off the ground, when suddenly the knot that the rookie tied around the rope comes free, and the tree snaps back to its original position, and at about 50 miles an hour launches Clyde, the cat, out of the woman's backyard across a small creek bed and into blackberry bushes about 100 feet away. I will never forget the sight of the cat the moment the knot snapped, and the death grip it had on the tree as it shot back upwards, all the way it cartwheeled, end over end, and disappeared into a dense crop of blackberries well out of our line of sight. And I definitely won't forget the noise it made either. And let me tell you, it is exactly the noise you think a cartwheeling cat might make. Sort of a constant roar. Still makes me laugh every time I think about it. So we're all just standing there laughing our asses off when the woman comes back into the backyard with 2 plates of cookies and inquired as to the whereabouts of her cat. Just that moment, we get toned out by MVA and have to rush back to the emergency vehicles to respond while our battalion chief sputtered through some sort of response to the woman's question. The cookies were delicious too, and a couple of days later, the same woman called and informed another crew that Clyde was home safe and none the worse for wear.